In the name of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. It is such a delight to be with you today. Michael and Millicent are up here in the front pew, which I'm pretty sure is where they sat when we lived here for 5.5 years, which was already a decade ago, believe it or not. It is such a blessing to be here, and I am delighted that Emily Richards is your rector. I cannot commend her to you enough. Emily and I were friends when I was here in Pennsylvania. When I heard that a new priest was coming to our diocese and that it was right up the road, and learned that the new priest was a female and that what her age is, which is mine, and that she's from Kentucky, I thought that is enough to make a friendship on. So my kids and I went to her institution when she was installed there at St. Peter's Glenside. And it was during that friendship then, as I was discerning a new call, I learned of St. Stephen's Richfield, and I said to Emily, "Isn't this where you were?" Indeed, she had been assistant there, and during a very difficult time in the history of that congregation. And so she was able to add some depth to my understanding of the church, which had really done a good job, I have to say, of reconciling themselves to the really hard time that they had been in the previous rector's relationship with them. But nonetheless, it was really assuring to have Emily help me explore the depths of the challenges that they were facing as they were embarking on a new time. And so here we have Dosey Dode. She's the rector here at St. Thomas's, and I'm the rector at St. Stephen's, and we can commend each other to everyone else. Also, just a little update on our family, because we did move already about 10 years ago, the summer of 2012, and so Gabe, who was entering high school when we moved, is now 24 and has graduated college, living in Brooklyn, working there, and developing a band with his roommates. Vivian is in her senior year at Bryn Mawr, and will finish there this spring. Beatrice is in her freshman year at Clark University in Worcester. And Millicent's right up here. She'll be 16 in a few months, and she was going into first grade when we left. And she was 6 months old when we came here. So, you know, hers is probably the most radical changes that you have seen among all of our kids. Michael is also here and has continued to be such a partner in life in all ways. And he's teaching 7th grade English at a public school in the neighboring town. And you will hear him say he loves 7th graders. Teaching is hard. It every year has a new reason for being hard, whether because he remade himself to help everything life happen. So first it was hard because he started teaching, and then it was hard because it was pandemic, and now it's hard because it's post-pandemic. So maybe one time it'll be an easy year, yet to be discovered. So we are all really glad to be with you today, and I feel so honored to be sharing the good news with you this morning, especially as we remember the blessed Absalom Jones. His feast day is today, February 13th. He was ordained a priest in 1804, the first black priest in the Episcopal Church. And as I was reflecting on what to share about his life, I was curious about the readings that had been appointed for his feast day. You heard the reader read from Ephesians, which is the lesson, the epistle, that's appointed for his feast day. And because you heard it only once, I'm going to read it to you again. Romans is really good too, but it's not what I built my sermon on. So I want to clue you in to what I'm talking about. In Ephesians chapter 4, the first 6 verses, Paul writes to the church there, "I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all." You most definitely recognize a portion of this passage because we say it at baptism. I was curious, though, as to why the church leaders thought this was a wise passage when we remember Absalom Jones. And what stuck out to me is this one line here in the middle of this reading. Bear with one another in love. Make every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. This is indeed how Absalom Jones lived his life. As one of my references for preparing today's sermon, I read the Reverend Dr. Harold Lewis, the late Reverend Dr. Harold Lewis's sermon on Absalom Jones in 1991. You can find it on our national church's website. Harold Lewis died on December 31st, 2021, just 6 weeks ago. He was a great oak, as one described him, in the church. If you don't know him, then I would commend him to you as well. He was a chronicler of the African American struggle in the Episcopal Church. He was the director of the Office of Black Ministries from 1983 to 1994. He served on numerous boards, and he is well remembered by most people for his leadership in the Lift Every Voice and Sing hymnal. Additionally, he wrote a book called Yet with a Steady Beat, the African American Struggle for Recognition in the Episcopal Church. And so it is his sermon on which I rely for portions of mine in today's message. In his 1991 sermon on the feast day of Absalom Jones, Lewis writes, "We know how in the year 1787, Jones, along with fellow black worshipers in the balcony of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, were wrested to their feet and told that they were no longer welcome to worship there. The problem was, perhaps, that blacks in that congregation had become too numerous and potentially too powerful. Then, as now, integration, it would appear, was deemed to be a desirable end only if blacks were in a decided and controllable minority. One of Absalom's friends was Richard Allen. And after that incident, Allen and Jones created the Free African Society, a mutual aid society intended to support black Americans in a social and economic landscape that was not designed for their flourishing. They continued as fellow preachers in the Free African Society that they had founded, but in 1794, they went their separate ways. Allen opted for the plain Methodism that he believed was more suitable to the temperament of black people. Jones decided to cast his lot with the Episcopalians. Allen later founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but Jones toughed it out in the white establishment. We know that he paid dearly for his choice. He spent 10 years in deacon's orders and was finally ordained priest in 1804, having been granted a dispensation from Latin and Greek on the condition that he and the people of the congregation that he founded, St. Thomas African Church in Philadelphia, would not be members of the convention of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. Now, this is significant. It's as if to believe they're not even there, for diocesan convention is where every seat in our convention, in our diocese, every church is represented there, and it's collectively that we make decisions. So although they were granted the church, they would not be members of the convention of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. And so I'm struck with these words of Paul's to the church in Ephesus: bear with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Absalom Jones was born into slavery in Sussex County, Delaware in 1746. And when he was just 16, his owner sold him, along with his mother and siblings, to a neighboring farmer. That year, the farmer, Mr. Wynkoop, kept Absalom, but sold his mother and siblings. And you, if you know your history, know that this was pretty much a sentence to never seeing one another again. Mr. Wynkoop moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he became a merchant. And he, who considered Absalom his property, allowed him to attend Anthony Benezet's school, where he learned to read and write. While still enslaved, Absalom was granted by Mr. Wynkoop the chance to marry Mary King, an enslaved woman owned by a neighbor of the Wynkoops. Now, Mr. Wynkoop happened to be a vestryman of Christ Church, Philadelphia, and later St. Peter's. So on January 4th, 1770, Absalom and Mary King were wed. By 1778, Absalom had purchased his wife's freedom so that their children would be free. And he did this by collecting donations and loans to earn enough for her freedom. You see, according to colonial law, children took the status of their mother. So children born to slave women were born enslaved. Now, this is significant because it hadn't always been that way in our nation. In an episode of the radio program Seen on Radio, a show on Public Radio International, from the season 2, episode 3, entitled Made in America, Seeing White, Part 3, which aired on March 16, 2017, John Bywin is the interviewer, and from a certain portion of that show, I want to share with you his conversation with Ibram Kendi, the author of Stamped from the Beginning. Elizabeth Key was born in 1630. Her mother, an African, was effectively enslaved. Her father was not only a free white man, but a member of the Virginia Legislative Assembly, the House of Burgesses. Ibram Kendi points out that before her father's death, her white father, he basically asked her slave owner to free her when she became 15. The slave owner did not do that. Eventually, Elizabeth wed an indentured servant who also happened to have some law training in England. They sued for her freedom on the basis that her father was free, and also because by then, in the mid-1600s, she had become a Christian. And in English common law, it was the paternity that established the status of the child. It was the status of the child derived from the father. And it was also against English common law to enslave a Christian. So Elizabeth Key sued on the grounds that she was her English father's daughter and that she was a Christian. The colonial court ruled in her favor in 1655, and she was freed. But clearly this frustrated the ruling elite. So by the 1660s, Virginia had changed their laws to basically state that the status of a child was derived from their mother. So that is, the child of a Negro woman would be free if the mother was free, and a slave if the mother was a slave. Some slave owners had resisted exposing their African slaves to Christianity so long as the English law required them to free Christians. But the new law explicitly stated that slaveholders could offer, quote, the blessed sacrament of baptism, end quote, without fear of having to free the enslaved people who partook of it. So you see, my friends, that Absalom needed to buy his wife's freedom. He also wrote to his master seeking his own freedom, but was initially denied. In 1784, however, Wynkoop manumitted him, inspired by revolutionary ideals. Absalom took the surname Jones as an indication of his American identity. So he was married in 1770. Bought his wife's freedom in 1778 before his own through collecting donations and loans, and finally he himself was free in 1784. He was 38 years old. And so I return again to Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Bear with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Jones and Allen founded the Free African Society, which was first conceived as a non-denominational mutual aid society to help freed Africans and their descendants in Philadelphia. This was 1787. As 1791 began, Jones started holding religious services at the Free African Society, which the following year became the core of his African church in Philadelphia. Jones had bigger ideas. He wanted to establish a black congregation independent of white control while remaining part of the Episcopal Church. While holding on to this dream, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 happened. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones assisted Dr. Benjamin Rush in helping people afflicted by the plague because it was rumored, that black people initially were immune. Now, how do rumors get started? Perhaps partially because of the belief that Africans, people with dark skin, were of different makeup of people with white skin. And perhaps because they needed some way to justify someone to take care of the sick. According to Wikipedia, Jones worked often through the night. And when a prominent Philadelphian, Matthew Carey, published a popular pamphlet accusing blacks of profiting from nursing sick white citizens, Jones and Allen published a protest pamphlet in response. Do you know about these pamphlets? This was before social media, of course. So people would write them up and they would print them off and they would pass them out. So here, Jones and Allen were being accused of something ridiculous and had to come to their own aid to defend themselves. They described sacrifices that they and members of the Free African Society had made for the health of the city. Philadelphia Mayor Matthew Clarkson finally came to their aid, backed them up, because he had called on them for help, and he publicly recognized that Jones and Allen acted upon their desires to improve the entire community. Jones's responses to the overall crisis strengthened ties between free blacks and many progressive whites, which aided him later when he established St. Thomas's Episcopal Church. Almost 20 times more black people helped the plague-stricken than white people, which later proved crucial to this new established congregation. After a successful petition of to the Episcopal Church, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, the first black church in Philadelphia, opened its doors on July 17, 1794. Jones was ordained as a deacon in 1795 and as a priest in 1804, and he became the first African American priest in the Episcopal Church. According to Lewis, a month after St. Thomas Church opened, the founders and trustees published a pamphlet entitled "The Causes and Motives for Establishing St. Thomas's African Church of Philadelphia," saying that their intent was, quote, "to arise out of the dust and shake ourselves and throw off that servile fear that the habit of oppression and bondage has trained us up in." But as was mentioned at the start, this oppression did continue over St. Thomas, Philadelphia, with them not being able to be seated at diocesan convention. Unless you think that such hostility and discrimination was a thing of the past, Lewis reminds us that in the 20th century, in the Diocese of New York, at the start of the 1900s, the committee of the convention of the Diocese of New York, charged with considering the application of St. Philip's Church in Harlem to be recognized by it, rendered this judgment: "But this cannot prevent our seeing the face that they are socially degraded and are not regarded as proper associates for the class of persons who attend our convention. We object not to the color of their skin, but we question their possession of those qualities which would render their intercourse with members of the church convention useful or agreeable, even to themselves. It is impossible in the nature of things that such opposites should commingle with any pleasure or satisfaction to either." This was barely 100 years ago. So I'm reminded again of Absalom Jones' lived example of bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Jones fought to have slavery abolished, and he used moral suasion as his strategy, which was trying to convince whites that slavery was immoral, that it was offensive to God, and contrary to the nation's ideal. You know, no doubt, about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. But to take you a couple decades earlier, in the state of North Carolina, they had made it illegal to free slaves unless approved by a county court, a provision largely ignored by members of the Society of Friends. Quakers, we know Quakers. So Quakers would not only continue to free their own slaves, but in some cases they bought the slaves from other men in order to free them. In 1788, the North Carolina legislature passed a law allowing the capture and sale of any former slave who had been freed without court approval, and promised that 20% of the sale price would go as a reward to the person who reported the illegal manumission. Many freed African Americans fled the state, as you can imagine, to avoid being captured and sold back to slavery. And Philadelphia was one of the places they came. Jones, after becoming the first black and freedman to be ordained as a priest, and as the Constitution's deadline for abolition of the slave trade passed, Jones took part in the first group of African Americans to petition the U.S. Congress. Their petition related to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which they criticized for encouraging cruelty and brutality, as well as supporting the continual criminal practice of kidnapping free blacks and selling them into slavery. Jones drafted a petition on behalf of 4 freed slaves and asked Congress to adopt, quote, some remedy for an evil of such magnitude, end quote. The petition was presented on the 30th of January, 1797, by U.S. Representative John Swanwick of Pennsylvania. But you see, my friends, this was an uphill battle, because Christians had already sought the guidance of church leaders on the moral quandary of slavery. According to Lewis's sermon in 1723, planters in Virginia, concerned about the status of slaves who had been baptized, since the baptismal rite made several references to the rather troublesome issue of freedom, wrote to their bishop, the Bishop of London, for his erudite theological opinion on the matter, and this is what the Bishop of London wrote back. Christianity and the embracing of the gospel does not make the least alteration in civil property or in any of the duties which belong to civil relations. But in all these respects, it continues persons just in the same state as it found them. The freedom which Christianity gives is freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan, and from the dominion of men's lusts and passions and inordinate desires. But as to their outward condition, whatever that was before, whether bond or free, their being baptized and becoming Christians make no manner of change in it. And so far as Christianity is from discharging men from the duties of the station and condition in which it found them, that it lays them under stronger obligation to perform those duties with the greatest diligence and fidelity. This had been the message of the church under which Absalom Jones was a priest. This is what Absalom Jones was up against. This is the thinking he was trying to change. Although U.S. Representative George Thatcher of Massachusetts argued that the petition should be accepted and referred to the Committee on the Fugitive Law, the House of Representatives declined to accept the petition by a vote of 50 to 33. Jones submitted a similar petition 2 years later in 1799, which was also declined. I'm so amazed at Absalom Jones. His ability to take in the words of Paul, bear with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. My goodness, look at what he demonstrated with his life. He was known for his oratory skills, and if this is what he preached through both word and deed, then I can understand the powerful significance of the gospel message. John's gospel, which we read from today, which is appointed for his feast day, speaks about the beloved community. It's the only gospel that talks about the beloved community. And you hear this in our own national church dialogue about being a beloved community. In the passage that we read today, Jesus is in the Last Supper with his disciples, giving them all the instruction that he thinks they need for the certain future he knows, the uncertain future that they know. And he says in this passage, "You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father." This first sentence that I read just a moment ago, "You are my friends if you do what I command you," I perceive is often heard by people, received by people as a conditional statement. Much like we would have said in grade school, "Yeah, you can be my friend if you share your dessert with me." Or, "You can be my friend if you play with me on the playground." Or, "You can be my friend if you share that with me." Often we hear that phrase in a conditional, with a conditional ear. But that is not what Jesus is saying. He's saying, "You are my friends if you do what I command you," like you are a baker if you bake, like you are a welder if you weld, like you are a teacher if you teach. You can't claim to be a teacher and not teach. You can't claim to be a welder and not weld. You can't claim to be a baker and not bake. "You are my friends," Jesus says, "if you do what I command you." That's how I know your friendship. That's how I recognize you. It's in what you doing what I command you that I recognize you as friends. That's what we see in Absalom Jones. He had friendship with God. And it was through that friendship that many lives were literally saved. The gospel literally saves lives as we enter into a friendship with God, as we join God in God's redemption of the world, not because it's our idea, but because it needs to be done. And because we are friends with God, we want to enter into God's work so that people recognize us and they recognize God. This is why we celebrate Absalom Jones. This is why it's important that we know his story and the environment in which he grew and the environment in which he proclaimed the good news. This is why. Because the friendship with God literally saves lives. And so, as we remember him, the gift that he has given to us through his life lived, may we be encouraged. May we be encouraged to bear with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Amen.